Welcome or welcome back to Restoring the Narratives of Indigenous and Black New Englanders. This is part two, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about some of the things we've learned about Black folks and people of color who lived in Southwest New Hampshire and Southeast Vermont in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. If you want to catch the first part of this presentation that talked about the indigenous history of this portion of New England, I'll leave some information about part one. Perhaps I'll figure out some fun graphics to show you where to find the links and things like that. But that'll all be done post-production, so perhaps there'll be some fancy graphics here. So for starters, I'm Gail Golec, and I'm an archaeologist and historian. I also have a history podcast called The Secret Life of Death that I'll leave some links to again. And if you enjoy this and would like other content, you can check that out. But for now, let's talk about the Black history in this region. And I'm going to minimize and move my face out of the way. So the earliest records for Black people and people of color in this part of New England, unsurprisingly, shows up alongside our early white settlers' records. We have to assume that any Black people or people of color in this part of New England in the 1770s were either enslaved or came from an enslaved background. In New England, there were several active slave ports, but two of the most important that we think will play a role in what's happening in this part of New England in the 1700s. One was in Newport, or rather Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on the seacoast, and another one was in Middletown, Connecticut, which was on the Connecticut River, but inland from the seacoast there. And these were in operation from the mid-1600s to the mid-1700s. So it makes sense that these areas on the seacoast or in central Connecticut had a higher than average population of people of color just in their general population. And they would have been either enslaved or free, but they were often living in the households of other white people in those areas. So furthermore, it makes sense that when those Euro-American white folks moved from the seacoast or from southern Connecticut to interior portions of New England, where we are in New Hampshire and Vermont along the Connecticut River, that they would have brought those enslaved or formerly enslaved persons of color here along with them. And in much the same way that we see the Congregational Church feature prominently in early indigenous records in southern New England, which we talked about in part one of this talk, here in this part of New England, we see Black people participating in white churches in what were rural, predominantly white communities. And they actually show up in early church records at this time. And it's one of the few places in this early or late 1700s, early settlement period of this part of New England that we do see records of Black people and people of color show up in any kind of record, are the church records. So there's some examples here from this area that I've brought as examples of that. In 1778, the Congregationalist Church in Walpole, New Hampshire, reports a baptism of Barnabas, a Negro child belonging to Thomas Sparhawk. And just from the language that's used here, belonging to Thomas Sparhawk, we can infer that this child, Barnabas, was probably enslaved to the Sparhawk family. 30 years later, and across the river, right across the river in Westminster, Vermont, there's a record from their Congregationalist church, the East Parish Congregationalist Church in Westminster, that reports two women of color being admitted into their congregation, a woman named Jenny Lee and a woman named Sarah Sheldon, became members of that church in 1816. And not long after that 1816 record, we have the 1820 federal census. And so we're going to jump ahead a little bit, a few years to the 1820s. And I've just included this as a printed example of what the 1820 federal census looks like to give you an idea of how they're or how they're laid out and what sorts of information they're looking for in these records. So on the far left-hand side, where I've just highlighted the red box, you're going to have a list of the names of the heads of household. And that's all you're going to get. You're not going to get names of members of of that household, just the names of the heads of household in 1820. The next section has all these lines for different date or age ranges for free white males, free white females. Then there's a section for slaves and a number for males and females and age categories within that. And then on the far left or far right-hand side of the form, free colored persons. And again, that's broken down into males, females, and a number of age range categories. Here in New England in 1820, you're generally not going to find anybody listed in the slave categories here. Most, if not all, of the persons of color that show up in these records are going to be listed in the free colored persons list that we see here on the far right-hand side. So this is, I'm just going to move my face. Hold on a second. Dramatic reveal. There we go. So I showed you the printed version of the 1820 census because all of the ones that you'll come across in the regular records are all handwritten, and so it's a little messy. It's a little hard to follow. There's all these lines, and they're copies or photographs or sometimes photocopies of originals, which maybe weren't in great condition to begin with. So there are some issues when it comes to interpreting and looking at records like this. And again, here this is a record for the town of Vermont, the town of Westminster, Vermont. And so you're going to have similar to what we saw in the 1820 printed record, all of your names for the heads of household running down the left-hand side. This first grouping of people are your free white men, free white women. You're not going to have any slaves reported in Vermont. So all of the records on this side are referring to free colored persons. Okay, so there's actually quite a number of free colored persons in Westminster in 1820. It's kind of unusual. We are seeing, in general, we are seeing a lot more people of color show up in records of all kinds, in these census records. And I don't know if that is just reflective of the population, that there actually are more people of color living in these areas, or is it just that the record keeping system is better reflecting the people that are there? And again, we'll go back and forth with the term people of color. And it's important to point out, and we'll see this going forward, that a lot of the people of color living in this part of New England at this time, they are of mixed ancestry in many cases. So they are Black, but they're also of Indigenous ancestry as well, especially those who came from Southern New England and Eastern New England. They have a long history of being Black and Indigenous ancestry. So the people coming here may show up as in the records as Black or mulatto or Negro, but oftentimes when we do a little bit more research into their family, we find that there's an Indigenous ancestry line there as well. And we'll talk more about that later. But here in 1820 in Westminster, Vermont, again, there's a number of households that have people of color living in them. I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then the sixth one is the one we're going to talk most about right now. So we'll draw your attention to the record I've highlighted up here for a woman named Susanna Reed. And Susanna is very interesting. First off, she's a she. So she is a female head of household in 1820. Not unusual, but not terribly usual either. She is also a female head of household in a household of free colored people. There are no white people in this. This is a household of free colored persons, and they're all female. Also very interesting. So if we, I'll just point out some of, I'm pointing like you can see where I'm pointing. Use my pointer. We'll try that. So these little ticks all indicate one individual within a household. So we've got a female who is in the category of younger than 14, between another female who is between 14 and 26 years old, and then another female we presume to be Susanna, who is 45 years old or more. And Susanna, again, as I mentioned in right before, Susanna and her descendants become very important in my research going forward. My research into the people of color of Walpole and the people of color in Westminster. This record tells us that the family is in this area at least by 1820, as early as 1820, but we have reason to believe that they were here much earlier than that. And that Susanna likely came here to this area of interior New England with one of those white Anglo-American settler families from central Connecticut. She is born in Connecticut, so she shows up here presumably with one of those white families. And that part of Connecticut, again, was where there was a very large slave port in and around Middletown, Connecticut. So we're going to keep following the Reed family through time and bounce around a little bit in Walpole and Westminster. We're going to follow the data trail back into Walpole. So we were in Westminster in Vermont. Now we're in Walpole, New Hampshire, right across the river. And this record tells us that by 1850, there was a Negro family living at and working at and living near a shoe shop near the Mills Crossing in Walpole, New Hampshire. This record is a little bit odd. It is a reference from a 1963 town history of Walpole, and it gives us a lot of information about this Negro family. They worked. We know where they worked. We know where they lived. It gives us directions, very specific directions. You follow this field to the upper level and you cross a bank and da 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 da. This is where their house was located. And it tells us, it even goes on to say that their names are mentioned in the 1850 census, but it doesn't actually go so far as to give us those names. So it's mentioning all of this information about them. It's sort of talking around them, but it doesn't give us any information about them, specifically their names. And this is very reminiscent to me of when I started the first part one of this series. I had a reference to another story from Walpole, and it talked about a man who was remembering all of the men from town who served at Saratoga during the Revolutionary War, and there were 12 men, and he goes through and he lists all the men's names, and he gets to the 12th one, and he can't remember the guy's name, and he says, "No matter, 'twas a black man anyway." So very, very reminiscent of that, where we have all this information about them sort of in this cloud around them, but what their actual name is, that gets left out of the record. We see this happening over and over and over again. My face. But luckily for us, we do have access to the 1850 census in Walpole, and we have their names. So this is a record for Eunice Brooks. Eunice was the daughter of Susanna Reed, who we saw in that 1820 census record. And Eunice, at this point in 1850, she is a widow. She's living with her children, Joseph Lord, L. Nathan Robertson, Thaddeus, Harriet, William, and James Brooks, and a couple grandkids and another young child in that household. So from this record, we can see that they are living in a large extended family. They're all living together and they're all working together in that shoe shop in 1850. We also have other records from the Brooks family and their military service. I remember in my last, in part one, I talked about this tradition among Indigenous and Black folks in New England of military service. And this comes up again here with the Brookses. This we have who are again of mixed, they are of mixed Indigenous and Black ancestry. And two of Eunice's children, we have James Brooks and William Brooks. These are their records for their service during the Civil War. Both men served in the 54th Massachusetts Colored Infantry and served with distinction as well. The Brooks men also participated in town politics. This is a record from Westminster, Vermont, and it shows that members of the Brooks family were voting in elections going back as early as 1856. This particular record is from 1876 in the centennial, and we see I've gone through and highlighted some members of the Brooks family and extended family who are on record as residents of the town, and they are voting in the General Assembly elections here. So we have they're highlighted in red down here. So we have Thad Brooks, we have J.H. Williams, George A. Lord, and then up here in the corner, James Brooks as well. So all of these men, and this is we see this that them voting with regularity, that their names show up over and over again in town elections. And throughout the 1870s up to about 1900, members of the Brooks family were landowners in Westminster, Vermont. Their land, different land holdings were all in the same general rural area of town, from what we can tell, pretty much connected by a main road. So they're not all contiguous pieces of property, but we can tell from deeds like this one here from the Brooks family that they are, once we plot them all on a map, we can see that they're all connected by a main road. So it makes sense. So owning land for people of color at this time, not uncommon, but not really a common thing either. It was difficult for people of color to be able to own land, to have the money to buy a piece of property, to find somebody who would actually sell to you, because they didn't have access to banks. Really, pretty much Black people were not permitted to use regular banks in most places. So the fact that the family had a number of pieces of property and even owned houses and things like that is pretty significant, I think. And it's important because for a lot of reasons that you might imagine. For one, it gave the immediate family a place to live, a place to settle down, a place to call their own. And it would be less likely for them to be, if you had a piece of land and a piece of property and a house, you'd be less likely to be run out of town. And this is something that happened quite frequently to people of color. We see it in records turning up all the time in towns all over the area, that people that they were often warned out is a term you'll hear come up sometimes. And then there were various institutions that made it so that it would be easier to push them out and to move and to live somewhere else. But if you had a piece of property, that was yours, that was your home base. And so you could utilize that as protection for the most part. And it also served their wider family and the wider Black community as a place for other people to come to who perhaps had been run out of town in some other place. It gave them a place to come and stay, maybe get their feet under them, and a place of safety and community. So owning land like this becomes an anchor for the Reeds and the Brookses and their wider community. We have photographic evidence that some of the Brooks children were attending school while they lived in Westminster. This is a wonderful photograph, courtesy of Brad Purrington, of schoolhouse number 14 in Gageville, which is a village in Westminster, Vermont. And the date from this photo, sometime between 1874 and 1880. And the school children are broken out. The girls are all on the left-hand side, the boys are all on the right-hand side. And there's two little boys in there in that grouping who we think were probably part of the Brooks family or extended family. And again, depending on when exactly this photograph was taken, it could be any number of young boys who were in the various households of the Brookses. Other records from town in Westminster give us an idea of the kinds of jobs that the Brooks and the Reeds and their extended family were doing while they were living here. Because similar to banking, where people of color were not welcomed in traditional banks, there were just some jobs that people of color were not permitted to do at this time period. So anything with power or status, for the most part, they were not allowed into those professions. But regardless of that rule, people of color fully participated in their communities, and they contributed incredibly important things to their local economies. And so far from the research that we've done, we've seen that the Brookses, they were laborers for the most part. In 1850, we saw in Walpole they were working at a shoe shop. Here we have some other records from Westminster in the 1880s that show that some members were whitewashers and calcimenters, which seems to be something that a number of men in the Brooks family did as a profession. We see that George Lord was hired by the town to snow in a bridge, which I learned I assumed that it meant removing the snow from the bridge, but actually, what it is, at this time period, most of the bridges were covered bridges, and during the winter, people were riding around on sleighs or sleds pulled by horses, and so you'd need snow on a bridge to pull your sleigh through. So you'd have to have somebody come in, and because it was covered, it didn't have any snow on the bridge. You'd have to have somebody come and put snow on the bridge so that sleds and sleighs could move across the bridges, which makes total sense. I don't know why. I don't know why I thought it was removal, but I learned something. I learned something new. So they're doing work like that. We also have a record from a Mrs. Sugland who is cleaning a schoolhouse, and we have references to other family members cleaning buildings, municipal buildings in town as well. And they also farmed. They on either on the land that they owned that we talked about, or in land that they rented, because we also have records that they rented farmland from other people in town while in Westminster. Probably raising food for themselves, and anything extra that they had, they could sell and make some money on that. And so here we have a record of Joseph J. Lord from 1875 talking about some of his poultry. He was a poultry farmer. Another family member, Herbert W. Brooks, had an odd jobs business. And there are several ads for him in the local newspapers talking about the different services that he offered, removing trash, removing rubbish, doing whitewashing. Again, that comes up, delivering firewood, a number of different odd jobs that he was advertising in the paper. Others in the family worked as laborers on other farms or in mills. This photograph is of a wood chopping mill that was located at Westminster Station, Vermont in the 1890s. This mill supplied firewood for a corn canning factory, which was located right next to the railroad. And we see two men in this grouping here who, again, we assume are probably members of the Brooks family or extended family. We think the photograph comes from sometime around 1895. So again, that'll depend on who might actually be represented in that photograph, depending on the date of the photo. This photo, oh my goodness. Another profession you'll often see mentioned for people of color are musicians. And this photograph is of a man named Julius Willard. He is a relative by marriage of the Brooks family in Westminster. He was a rather famous musician in his time, apparently traveling all over the world and being involved in all sorts of really interesting musical reviews and in different venues all over the world. And he did this for years and years until his eyesight began to fail. And at that point, he moved in with a family in Grafton, Vermont, who were also musicians. And we can see that's where the photograph here is taken outside of that family's household. 1906, we have a date for this photograph. And this is just wonderful. I just love everything about this picture. It's beautiful picture of Julius, and he's showing off all of the instruments that he can play. He's got a banjo and a mandolin and some kind of lute, perhaps, and a violin, and it looks like there might be some flutes or other things on the table right behind him. Also, right behind him is a kitten. It's just the cutest thing I've ever seen. I love this picture so much. And the great thing about this is actually there's a series of photographs of Julius and the Parhams. That's the name of the family he's living with in 1906, and of them at their farm, and they're playing music and doing performances and pictures of them. And there's always a cat in the picture somewhere or a kitten, which I just think is fantastic. Makes me love it even more. But other records of people of color from this area are a bit more of a mystery for us. So here's this lovely little tintype photo of a young girl in a beautiful, beautiful little portrait album. This comes from the Hall collection at the Westminster West Library. And it's filled with similar types of portraiture, little photographs, little portraits of all local residents from this part of Westminster West, Vermont, dating from the 1860s to the 1870s. And all of the portraits have names. They're all labeled with the individual's name under them, except one, of course. The only one that doesn't have a name is that of a person of color. And so written instead of a name written around her photograph it says, a colored girl who lived at Washburns in Putney, meaning Putney, Vermont. So again, all of this information about her around her, but not her actual name, nothing about her. Oop, this is a little blurry, but this is the close-up of the photograph. And we can see that this girl's, she's in her best outfit. She's got a sweet little brooch at her neck, and her hair is all done up in bows and everything. And just as a side note, I didn't take these photographs, and I didn't handle this portrait. This was all done by Carolyn Frisia at Works on Paper. So this was all done, curated, professionally, photographed professionally. This is all in an effort to maintain the integrity of all this. I didn't just rip this apart and start, manhandling it or anything like that. So this is all done on the up and up. But we get to see a closer, much closer version of this girl and her outfit, and just get to see her face a little more clearly. But is there anything else that we can find out about her just based on that information in that photograph? Luckily, we do have we struck gold with the 1870 census in Putney, Vermont. There is a 16-year-old girl, a domestic servant named Lizzie Davenport, living in the household of John Washburn of Putney, Vermont. So her name is Lizzie Davenport. But one of the interesting things that comes up from this census record, we can see that Lizzie is not from this area. Lizzie is from Georgia. And while what's interesting about that is that most of the other people of color that we've been researching and learning about in this part of New Hampshire and Vermont have lived here for a number of generations. And here we have by 1870 something different happening. So the people who had been here have been here for generations. They're all, married, intermarried or friends, or we can find some sort of connection and relationship between these groups of people. But Lizzie is different. Lizzie was born in Georgia. And at 16 years old, and it's 1870, she was very likely born into slavery as well. And this highlights an interesting trend that we start seeing post-Civil War here in the Northeast. We start seeing a number of young, single people of color coming up from the South, and they're ending up in rural areas like Putney. And they're doing things like domestic service, like Lizzie is here, or they're working on farms. And we're not really sure how this is happening, why this is happening, what the connection is, if it's church, if it's other Black folks who are making connections to people they know down south, the soldiers coming back from the war, making connections and trying to bring people of color back up to the north to work, or what? Or is there some church or governmental program that's facilitating this? We're not really sure. But they show up in rural areas like this for a brief time, and then, as in Lizzie's case, we sort of lose track of them after the Industrial Revolution really kicks off by the 1880s and 1890s. This is the only record I have of Lizzie up in this area right now. Of course, she could have gotten married and changed her name or moved. She's probably somewhere, but this is all we know about her so far. But we do have this lovely photograph of her and finally a name for it, which I think is really, really nice and really important. And I'm glad we could have figured that out. So this has been a lot. I realize I've thrown a lot at you. And I'll just close by reiterating some points about the Black history and Indigenous history that I've been talking about in this presentation. It's very complicated. It's very nuanced, and it's so interesting. It's not, unfortunately, it's not as accessible as our history of our Anglo-American settlers. But there are a lot of people working on trying to remedy that. And it's going to require, it's requiring a lot of time and work and curiosity and ways of figuring, we're still figuring some of that out, of how to make this more accessible to people. As I said, a number of people are working on this. The Historical Society of Cheshire County in New Hampshire has started a website that has started to make available some of the biographies of people of color that they've come across in their research available. You can go to bipocmonadnock.org, and they're adding stuff to this all the time. So the idea that this will be an active website as their research carries on. They're going to be adding more and more information to this as time goes on. Absolutely. So check that out and keep checking that out to look for to try to find connections and information about people living in southwestern New Hampshire and a little bit in southeastern Vermont. And I know just from talking to other researchers in this area, there are a number of other people doing research into Indigenous and Black history all around New Hampshire and Vermont. And there are a lot of people who are interested in starting research projects. And so we're working together to try to figure out how to make our connections with other researchers and how we're going to share information, and then how we share that with the public. What's the best way to do that? But we're getting started. It's a process. But it's coming. It's on the way. Again, to close out, another shameless plug for me. If you liked this presentation, if it was interesting and you learned something, and you'd like to learn a little more about some of these lesser known historical topics from New Hampshire and Vermont, please check out my podcast. It is thesecretlifeofdeath.com. You can find my podcasts on that. You can stream it right there from the website, or you can find it on your favorite podcast platform and stream it right from there. And you can sign up for my newsletter at the website, and you can keep up to date on any engagements and events and speaking things that I have coming up, and little tidbits about research that I come across along the way. Finally, I want to thank Heather Holloway and Wade Smith of Mill Hollow Works for the invitation to do this presentation in the beginning. I very much appreciate everything they do, and anything I can do to support their efforts, I am happy to do. I want to thank the Reed and Brooks family for sharing their research with me and being so willing to have me share it with the public as well. To the Westminster Historical Society for also sharing all of their research. Some of the photos you saw here today were because through their files, helping me sort through everything and figure out everything Westminster that I didn't know. Brad Purrington for his use of his photograph of the students at the school in Westminster, to the Westminster West Library for the use of their photo of Lizzie Davenport, and to the whole gang at the Historical Society of Cheshire County, New Hampshire. They took me into their research project. They started their Recovering Black History project 4 years ago, took me in as a researcher and let me kind of run wild with some of the stuff I found. And it's been a pleasure and a joy to share with them and learn from them. They're an amazing organization, and I can't thank them enough. And for all the people that I mentioned, all the things they do to help preserve and promote and protect history. Yay, yay to all of you. And thank you. Thank you all for sitting through this and listening to me. All of my history nerd friends, thank you for showing up. And it's been a total and complete pleasure to be with you today to share these stories. Please take exquisite care of yourselves. And until next time, thank you so much. Bye.